Hi, hello everybody, and very happy to have this conversation even online. I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkley Center, and I deal with question of religion and politics, both domestic and international. And I have also focused on Islam. So I would like my colleagues to introduce themselves, and then I give it back to Ryann for the students' presentation. So who is José? José, please. Let me mute.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I was very pleased to read all your projects. They are great. They are great, and obviously critical comments are good, but it's only because we want to add something to what you have to say. But I have to say that I enjoy very much reading your projects.
Thank you, José. Shaun?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shaun Casey. I'm the director of the Berkley Center, and excuse me, the allergies are killing me right now, so I probably don't have much to say. But I just want to agree and second what José said. These were remarkably interesting investigations, and you saw some of the robust responses from. I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion. So thank you, and again, thank you, Ryann, for thinking of this ingenious way to salvage and actually redeem and help us interact with our students in a very interesting way. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Shaun. Drew?
Good afternoon, everyone. Jocelyne, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I'm Drew Christiansen. I teach the REWA course for Berkeley. I'm a senior fellow there and teach ethics and international affairs. I'm sorry I've not been able to be as attentive to this as others. I have read all the contributions, but I've been involved in multiple task forces for the Holy See on the pandemic. And on nuclear policy this week. So I've been writing all sorts of memos myself. But I have read everything and be happy to be part of the dialogue today.
Thank you, Drew. David.
I'm David Hollenbach. I teach in the School of Foreign Service and a fellow at the Berkley Center, and I'm affiliated faculty member in the theology department. So I reach across the issues of religion, ethics, and international affairs, and I enjoyed reading your posters and material connected with it, and I look forward to the discussion very much. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, David. And Katherine?
So I'm a fellow at the Berkley Center. I work on the links between religion and international development that also includes humanitarian and peace building, and looking forward to hearing your elaborations of your papers.
Thank you, Katherine. So Ryann, I pass it back to you for the student presentation.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for the introductions from our faculty. We do actually have a few others on the call. There's a couple of Berkley Center staff that are here as well. No, we're not. It's okay. That's me.
Sorry.
So Claudia Winkler and Ruth Gopin are joining us as well. And I want to thank them for their support in helping me organize this and helping everything get set up for today. So we're going to start with our student presentations, and our first presenter actually was not able to, I can't minimize. Okay, never mind. Sorry, learning things as a host. Okay, Maya was not able to actually be with us, but she has sent us a recording of her presentation. So I'll introduce her and then I'll play her recording. So Maya James is an undergraduate majoring in government and minoring in religion, ethics, world affairs, and creative writing. She'll be attending Harvard Divinity School in the fall and studying religion, ethics, and politics, particularly the intersection of political and religious rhetoric in the peace building process. And her presentation is on the destruction of sacred spaces as preludes to genocide in China and Bosnia.
Hi, my name is Maya James. I'm a graduating senior at the REWA program. I just wanted to thank the Berkley Center for making this happen, and especially to David Bennett, who was an overwhelmingly positive influence on my paper writing process. So I've already posted some information about my research on the poster, but I'm just going to give a brief overview of my research question. the general outline of my paper and then some recommendations I've left at the end of my conclusion. So the main question I'm asking is, how do states attempt to use security concerns, and that's in quotes, to justify the destruction of sacred spaces? In other words, how do states justify genocide through state security rhetoric? The short answer is they don't. The longer answer is that Bosnia and China's security concerns are illegitimate and do not warrant the destruction of religious spaces to alleviate those alleged concerns. Furthermore, the destruction of sacred spaces is not only a form of physical and psychological violence, but a prelude to ethnic cleansing and genocide. As far as the organization of the paper goes, I start by defining what sacred spaces are, and I include several religious and non-religious backgrounds, an example of which might include how architects might define what a sacred space is, and then in terms of religious backgrounds, I also include Yoruba traditional religion, even though they're not mentioned in the paper, as well as several Abrahamic religions, and honestly, just as much as I could pull in to make sure I was giving an accurate summary of what a sacred space means, since it's not just, brick and mortar, it's sometimes land in the case of several Native American religions, and also in several traditional cultures. And this also includes graveyards, which is tied to the land that it's on. So after I define sacred spaces, I then explain how Bosnia and China attempt to project security threats onto these sacred spaces through rhetoric and then literal destruction of these spaces. For Bosnia, I then explain how the International Criminal Court directly attributed willful damage to religious institutions as a war crime. And for China, I follow a similar format, except I don't include the part of the International Criminal Court because they have not been held accountable for their actions against Uyghurs. So after I've established their security concerns and dismantled those arguments, I end with some tangible recommendations for international and regional actors. And this can also include nonprofits who are interested in making never again a reality. So my first recommendation is that international organizations and regional organizations must take more seriously the destruction of religious sites as a factor in signaling future human rights abuses. And that's just a wordy way of saying that when groups produce these early warning systems for genocide, destruction and desecration of religious sites should be more deeply embedded within the systems as a warning that's, things are about to go wrong very quickly. And second, I suggest that intervening actors need to interact more sophisticatedly with local religious actors and institutions. And I think this step has more room for innovation. As an example of this might include utilizing military chaplains during peace discussions, since they're perceived to hold higher morals than politicians and peace builders might. And last, I suggest that actors should closely monitor speech acts as early warning signs of ethnic cleansing intentions. And this is the easiest step, in my opinion, to follow. For example, if a state official promises never again in the same sentence and then calls all Muslims terrorists within the same breath, there's a high chance that they're willing to harm that group of people. And so these recommendations have space for growth, but I think they're good. They're a good start to hopefully making never again an actual reality rather than just a theory to talk about in papers.
So I hope you were all able to hear that okay. I know it was a little challenging, but okay, great. So, and Maya said she's more than happy to engage in comments either on the blog or by email if you have any feedback for her as well. So now we will go to, is he still on here? Uh-oh. I think we lost our next presenter. I don't see him. Okay, we will skip that and we'll go to Michael. Michael, are you ready for yours?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. I'll go ahead and introduce you and then I'll hand it back over to you to take it from there. I just need to pull up your bio. Okay, here we go. So Michael is a graduating senior in the college, majoring in government with minors in philosophy and REWA. Next year, he will hopefully be attending law school at Columbia or NYU, and he eventually hopes to work in public interest law. He'll be presenting on holy seeing an advantage in international law. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Hi, everybody. Wish everyone a happy Georgetown Day under different circumstances. So for mine, I'll try to keep it to the minute, 2 minutes. The question I was hoping to look into was how do the unique aspects of the Holy See change how the Roman Catholic Church is able to promote its initiatives in the context of international law, and how that relates to whether it be in bilateral situations or multilateral situations. And I thought that was a very interesting question to look into, because before I'd taken this class, I'd never seen the Catholic Church in that kind of lobbying capacity. And I wanted to explore how that intersects with international law, which is an interest of mine. And for the method, I plan on comparing the Holy See's work in a number of examples, but it's mostly looking at arms treaties that they've stricken over the years, as well as in environmental movement of recent times. And in general, I was starting to see that within a multilateral context, the Catholic Church is able to see greater prowess, because its status as just a non-state is able to allow it to transcend a lot of other political implications, and that there are Catholics everywhere. It's able to help in these regards. So I'm a bit not as far as some others may be in terms of their theses, because mine's doing a little bit further away, but that is what I have thus far.
Great, thank you, Michael. Okay, it sounds like Sammy is having some trouble connecting, so we'll hopefully be able to get to his presentation later. But we'll go ahead and go to Matthew. Let me unmute you. I will also introduce you, and then I'll turn it to you. Oops, we're just muting each other back and forth. There we go.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Yep.
Let me introduce you. Sorry. Pulling up bios as we go. So Matthew is a senior in the college, and he's majoring in government with minors in Arabic and REWA. He has a passion for public service and international affairs, which started with a Global Human Rights Fellowship at the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And he also his presentation today is actually his government honors thesis. So he's not technically in the capstone course, but he is a REWA student, and we have allowed him to participate in this because his thesis is serving as his capstone paper. So we're really excited to hear about your research, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so this is the culmination of my senior honors thesis in the government department. It's a 2-year long program, so it's been about 2.5 years, I guess, of research into this paper that I adjusted to kind of focus on the more religious aspects of what my original paper was about for Berkley Center purposes, and it was really interesting to get into that. So my research explores the use of non-state actors by the US as a proxy in counterterrorism strategy. So there are a number of counterterrorism strategies to use. Most common would be the direct approach. So that includes drone strikes, assassinations, direct engagement with the enemy, etc. Numerous operations enduring freedom that I am not an expert on. But another very popular approach is the non-direct approach. So this is precisely what proxy war is using another actor to accomplish your own foreign policy goals. So this, I notice, has never really been studied in the context of non-state actors. It's always been studied in the context as we are trying to use another state, we are trying to control another state. But what happens when we try to control a certain religious minority or tribal minority or ethnic minority? What are the conditions under which this relationship is effective? So I looked, I did a comparative case analysis of 2 major non-state actors, one being the SDF, which is the Syrian Democratic Forces, the other one being the Afghan local police, or the ALP. So the SDF being largely Syrian Kurd, which is about 99% Sunni Muslim. It is, again, dominated by the Kurds, but the US, when creating the SDF, did incorporate other ethnic and religious minorities, Syriac Christians, Turkmens, Chechens, amongst others, even some members from the PKK, which is the Kurdistan Worker Party, which is designated as a terrorist group for both the United States and for Turkey, because they have waged insurgency in Turkey for about 30 years. The Afghan local police, a little bit different because they're not dominated by any one minority group. It's a mix of a lot of mostly ethnic minorities that come with their own religious affiliations. So Hazara, Punjabs, several more others, or thousands of them really, that were all recruited to patrol usually their own local communities. Sometimes not, but I'll touch on that later, that were divided into smaller units throughout Afghanistan and were given smaller kind of village level security missions, as opposed to the SDF, which was directly engaging with the Islamic State. So some of the things that I found out of this were that these non-state groups are much more likely to succeed if they have their own sovereign or at least semi-sovereign territory. And I know that that was kind of a hot topic in the comments of my poster, so I'm happy to touch on that later as well. The limit to that is that non-state groups having their own territory is a little bit tricky because it still exists within the context of internationally recognized states. So we do, as the US, put a lot on the line in terms of our relationships with other states when we do partner with those non-state actors. Non-state groups are more likely to succeed if they have experience in conventional and unconventional warfare. So this would be the case of the SDF, who has probably one of the most tumultuous minority groups that I can think of in the Middle East, that has decades and decades and decades of tribal and interreligious fighting. Non-state groups are more likely to succeed if they have a politically benevolent relationship with their host government. This is also a little bit tricky and has limitations as well, because sometimes support from the host government comes in the form of the government turning their back on the group when they commit crimes in order to not arrest them and not take away their manpower. So this was a big case in the ALP. Lots of recorded human rights abuses, both religiously motivated and tribally motivated, which contributes to greater regional instability. So might be tricky there as well. And then lastly, smaller non-state groups are more likely to succeed if they have smaller missions and are acting locally. So kind of the limitation or implication of that for policy is that it really only works if the non-state group is protecting the village from which it originates. So you can't have a Hazara ALP unit be monitoring Pashtun district in Afghanistan. This is when you get a lot of the most numerous human races, and as I previously mentioned, almost none of them were actually punished because both the US and Afghanistan didn't want to lose that personnel. So I'm happy to answer any questions or address any comments that you might have. I know it's kind of a hot topic, and I'm really excited to engage in this material with you all. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matthew. And it looks like, Samut, you've been able to join us, which I'm delighted. I'm gonna unmute you now. Are you good?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
Okay, great. I will introduce you and then hand it back to you to do your presentation. So Samut is a senior in the SFS, majoring in international economics with minors in history and REWA. And he is highly interested in learning about the intersection of religion and politics and religious-based conflict. So I'll hand it back over to you to go ahead and do your presentation.
Cool. Yes, just one bit. Thank you for the opportunity to present this. So what I was looking into was essentially holy site governance in two sites. One was Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Israel, and then the Ayodhya site in India, where essentially is Hindu-Muslim tensions over mosque that was then destroyed in the 1990s. And so the primary aim of what I was trying to look at was how the governance of these sites ties into ideas of justice, peace, and then just stability moving into the future. I'd say, just to keep things brief, the key, I think, finding or heft of my research was trying to see, in a lot of ways, Israel, and the site there had developed some sort of a stable status quo post-1967. Obviously, there's still tension and volatility there, but not at the same level there is in India, where in the 1990s you had the violent destruction of the mosque. And then even now you still have Hindu-Muslim violence across the country in a lot of ways tied to that holy site issue. And so I think one of the key areas my paper focuses on is this idea of sovereignty tying into restraint from a state actor, where there's a lot of history, there's a lot of grievances caused by religion, especially because religious communities have facts that they can collectively come together. A lot of cases don't necessarily line up with historical realities. And so in terms of adjudicating these conflicts, like looking backwards doesn't always work. So instead, when governments are able to look forward and find a way to work with the political realities on the ground to not overturn those on the ground situations too much, there's a lot of scope for stability, even as some groups might not be completely satisfied. So again, like getting to specifics, so Israel post 1967, they made a strong effort to make concessions to Palestinian groups as well as the state of Jordan, where they gave Muslim groups regulatory power over the mosque site on Temple Mount. Muslims were able to worship with the presence of the Israeli Defense Forces in the area, while Jews use the Western Wall as their primary worship site. And so there is a sense of stability there, where from a religious perspective, the majority groups from both the Muslim and Jewish sides have their needs met. While in India, until 1992, you had the mosque where Hindus had one of their most sacred sites, which they thought the birthplace of one of their gods. And so that boiled over in 1992 when the Hindu group destroyed the mosque. And so there's a whole legal battle, Supreme Court case, finally resolved in 2019, where they gave Hindu groups the right to rebuild the temple there and allocate a separate plot of land for Muslims. And the reason why this is a bit more dangerous is because there's this precedent set where destroying the mosque had some tangible benefits and gains for the Hindu groups. And so one of the key findings I saw was that in the same vein that Israel asserted their military dominance in some sense and security over Jerusalem, they worked with the groups that they were fighting with, the Palestinians in the state of Jordan, to still give them some significant concessions, which I think in a lot of ways helped mitigate some of the volatility. I think the onus moving forward for India is to do the same thing with Muslim groups within their country, to give significant and tangible concessions where there will be some resentment, but that can be ameliorated to the greatest extent possible. So that is the gist of that. So I will turn it over to questions.
We're going to actually wait and do questions during the discussion at the very end. So we'll keep moving along to student presentations, but thank you so much. We're going to go to Will next, and I will introduce Will and then he can participate. I just unmuted you. So Will is a senior in the SFS, majoring in international politics and minoring in Chinese and receiving an Asian Studies certificate. During his study abroad in China, he conducted field research on various social topics while completing a thesis on the South China Sea entirely in Chinese, which I find very impressive. Will is actually also an outlier. So he is technically not a REWA student, but he is participating in the capstone course. And we felt like his capstone was worthy of participating in this discussion. So we're very excited to have you join us today, and I'll hand it over to you to present on your research.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Craig. So it is important to note that my inspiration for this research on Chinese religion was kind of unique in two ways. First, because I found the inspiration to research it when I was abroad in China, and I was watching all of these minority religious groups interact that I didn't even know existed. And then secondly, this was kind of the first time I've researched Chinese domestic politics. Dr. Craig mentioned I've done a lot of work on the South China Sea, and I'm constantly looking at Sino-US relations, but it's rare that I look at China's domestic political situation. So I was happy to have the opportunity to do that in this course. In November, when I was talking with Professor Kessler about this project, I told him that my central premise was that China is disingenuous to its past regarding religion. So even though the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, endorses atheism, religion has been in China for centuries. And party teachings encourage citizens to honor their roots. But the big paradox is that if these roots are tied to religion, you're just supposed to forget about them. But some religious groups in China have fared better than others. So I asked why, for example, China's Uyghur Muslims faced greater repression than the Hui Muslims, and why Chinese Buddhists could practice more freely than Tibetan Buddhists. And finally, why would the government allow Protestants to worship in the 80s if it was skeptical of the Catholic Church at the same time? So generally speaking, I found that those who accepted the CCP's social, familial and geopolitical policies, enjoy greater religious liberties than those who don't. In other words, whether a religious group resists or embraces the CCP's first response to its existence determines the group's fate. And I define the CCP's first response as its method of interacting with a religious group for the first time. And here, it's very important to note that although some of the religious groups I study have been in China for centuries, the CCP has only been around since 1949. And this has made things worse for a lot of religious groups like Uyghur Muslims who have indeed worshipped in freedom for centuries and were then asked to accept party supervision of their religion 70 years ago. The Uyghur Muslim example has caused great division in the Islamic community because China's Hui Muslims accepted party control, which Uyghurs considered selling out. And now Uyghurs and Huis don't get along, which I realized when I was studying abroad. And I saw Uyghurs and Huis calling each other ethnic slurs. And this was not something I had expected to see. And so I was obviously prompted to do more research into why this was happening. But what the Hui people did, which was accept the CCP's oversight, pretty much ensured their survival, regardless of how the Uyghurs felt about it. And this is essentially the conclusion of my research, that groups who, like the Hui, entered into a social contract with the CCP are better off than those who didn't. And so my case studies demonstrate that this is true across all of the faiths I looked at. And there are, of course, other factors at play, like living in a disputed region or belonging to a global religious institution. But overall, the trend is very clear. You have to have good relations with the government if you want to survive. And so the world is watching how China treats its religious minorities nowadays. So I felt that this research topic was particularly relevant to share with you all. And it has truly been one of my most fascinating research endeavors at Georgetown. So I look forward to talking about it with you all further. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Will. Okay, finishing us off is Rachel Corbally. So I'll introduce you and then, let me unmute you before I forget. There we go. And then I'll hand it over to you. So Rachel is graduating in May as an SFS student in STIA with minors in Spanish and REWA. And she is concentrated on cybersecurity as a Scholarship for Service Cyber Corps recipient. She's also returning in the fall for her second year in an accelerated master's program concentrating on military operations. So Rachel, please take it away.
Thank you so much for giving us all the opportunity to present on our work. I took the REWA capstone class in spring of 2019, and so the current events of the time had played an influential role in my research. So in January 2019, President Putin traveled to Belgrade to meet with the president of Serbia, and a week later, the patriarchs of both nations met in Moscow. A topic of concern to all parties was the Serbia-Kosovo conflict. However, Serbia and Kosovo had been at odds since the 1990s, and so I asked myself, why is Russia, almost 30 years later, only now reinvigorating its religious political relationship with Serbia? And it was this question that guided my research. So through historical, religious, and political analysis, I argue that the church's historic position as a peace builder and conflict resolution is exploited by Russia in order for it to exert its own political agenda in the region. And I examined Russia's revitalization of its religious friendship with Serbia as a case study to support my argument. I explored the relationship between the Russian state and the Orthodox Church in order to understand the interaction between the two, as well as understand how Orthodoxy has been embraced as a nationalist movement. Then I examined how Orthodoxy has played a role in Serbian history and its identity, and I complemented this analysis by considering how religion has been a tool utilized by many states when creating a national identity, which gives context to how religious values place Russia and Serbia in a larger pattern of international relations. With this foundation, I was able to explore and analyze how Russia's efforts to revitalize its religious relationship in Serbia work to increase Putin's favorability in Serbia and thus widen the division between Serbia and the West. Russia capitalized on its shared religious history with Serbia, a bind unique to the Eastern experience, using Orthodox Church as its prop. And having been brought closer to Russia through its religious values, Serbia in 2019 no longer jostled between Western organizations or favoring Russia. Russian influence in Serbia makes it very likely that the same technique will be employed within other Orthodox states, and consequently in Russia's conquest to deteriorate the liberal world order and secure itself, the political relationships that are formed from shared religious beliefs, as seen in the case between Russia and Serbia, will become increasingly common, especially in the Balkan region.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm going to turn it back over to Jocelyne to lead our discussion.
Okay, thank you all, and let me reiterate how impressive all this work is in all capacities, the coverage of ideas, the scope of case studies. And I don't know if it's serendipity or something else, but it happened that I have been either researching or writing, and I'll be sharing with some of you some of this writing on some of the cases as we go, as we address one after the other. So since two of you will have to leave by one, I am going to start with Michael and the Holy See, and then I will move to Rachel. The two of you have to leave before one. So in terms of management of time, I was told that we have 5 to 7 minutes, which includes not only my comments, but my other colleagues' comment as well. So if any of you, and I have read the comments online from some of you, wants to jump in, please do so, or I can call upon you. It really, we leave this a little informal here. So Michael, this is very important work for one reason, because the international role, either multilateral or bilateral, of the Holy See has not indeed been systematically studied, for reason that the religious dimension of international organization has been completely discarded from the analysis of international relations. So you are onto something, and I think it would enhance your approach if you make it clear that this is in IR, in international relations, quite a new approach. And also to take into account that in this international secular order, religious organizations do not have as many tools as they would like to have. So how does the Holy See has carved its own niche with the tools that are available, knowing that, you know, regulation of religious violence and conflict is not really on the agenda of religious organizations. So what does it mean for this secular order to deal with a group like the Holy See, either in multilateral or bilateral treaties? So that's my overall comment, but I know that there are scholars, colleagues, much more competent on the Holy See than I am. So I'm happy to share the floor with José, who said things, David, and Drew too. The three of you had more background on that. But keep in mind this, as you are in international relations, to make it clear that this is not a common or typical approach. Okay. José, you want to say something? David is talking, but you have to unmute. Or do I unmute them? How does it go? I'm gonna
do it.
Okay.
Now, okay. Is that all right if I speak?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. This is a fascinating area. Matthew, I'm very grateful for reading your poster, and I'd be very interested to see, you know, what you do in this in greater depth in a thesis or in a paper and so forth. But one of the questions that arose for me as I was reading your poster was how there's been a very interesting body of literature about transnational actors and about non-state transnational actors. And Robert Cohen and Joe Nye and so forth have done a lot on this, and so has Katherine Sickink on a variety of initiatives where non-state agents have become advocacy groups transnationally. Sickink has this book basically on advocacy groups, international advocacy groups that are mainly secular. She has in mind groups like Human Rights Watch and Doctors Without Borders and so forth. But someone like Brian Hare has brought in the religious component of this, about the religious transnational actors, and he studied in particular the Holy See. And he makes the claim that the Holy See is the most sophisticated transnational actor in the world. It's an organization that's been around for 2,000 years. It reaches across a whole range of countries and has roots in many countries. And I'm just interested to know to what extent, the material that you get into is very interesting, but it's mainly examining it from a sort of state point of view and looking at the Holy See kind of from the state side. But the interesting question would be to look at it from the inside of what the Holy See thinks it's doing and how it's doing what it's doing that might be raising some interesting other angles on this. So not having read your material in any depth, just looking at your poster, those are sort of ideas that came to me right off the top of my head.
Thank you. José, do you want to?
Yes, just very briefly, you saw, Michael, you saw my comment, and the main comment was that the crucial issue is not whether bilateral or multilateral, but the particular forms of bilateral and the particular forms of multilateral context. And when the interests of the Holy See are beyond their own interests and try to articulate a common good that can be shared by the different actors. The general comment I would like to make, which is, if you have seen my comments, I'm a comparative historical sociologist, and most of our issues have long histories. And I invite all of you to look at them with some historical depth. And basically, this is when it comes to this issue, of course, during the Middle Ages, the Holy See was the primary international court of law, international legitimacy. And this is something which, of course, the Westphalian system explicitly tried to shut out the papacy. And for several centuries, it was able to do. But the more the world has been globalized since World War I, the Holy See came back. It was crucial in the formation of the League of Nations. Has been a crucial defender, supporter of every form of transnational, international agency, courts, etc. And it's very important, precisely, anybody studying international relations to take this into account.
Thank you, José. Drew, would you have something to say on? Unmute.
Sorry. Let's see here.
Go ahead. You're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thanks. I would add that it seems to me that the Holy See does take, as David was suggesting, does take the organizations of civil society very seriously, and part of its clout in a contemporary world exists in the alliances it makes with various groups on issues. Climate change is an example. Nuclear disarmament is another, where the Vatican has worked with civil society. At the same time, it works to put a coalition, or works with a coalition of willing states in the international arena. Usually there'll be not the dominant states, but maybe a majority of states, as in the case of nuclear disarmament, opposed to those who are in control, trying to introduce some new element of, and there I think it's really important to see that part of the Holy See's edge in these issues is its vision, is its Catholic social teaching, and the notion that there is a kind of common good of the world that needs to be served, and that the institutions of the world need to be moved to serve that common good. So I would take it out of simply a bilateral, that's a more traditional kind of way of Vatican diplomacy, where the Church was interested, as it is more recently in China, in securing its own role. But in terms of international relations, the multilaterals become very important, both with civil society and with other states.
Thank you, Drew. Katherine, raise your hand.
Just very quickly, I was intrigued by one of the comments in your poster. how does it exert its will? And how is the will of the Holy See, of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church, which are all slightly different in their conception, how does it decide what its will is, as well as the sort of tools to exert it? But the other point that I also raised in my comment is that the Holy See has a unique position with its observer status in the United Nations, as obviously as a state, but also very much as a religious body. And this has been quite contested. I think there's even a movement to end that, as well as more positive questions about whether other communities might have a similar status. So interested in your reactions to those.
Shaun also has, I'm going to unmute you, okay, Shaun? Yeah.
Thank you, Jocelyne. Three very quick points. Brian Hare gave the Berkley Center lecture last fall on this comparison of three popes in terms of Vatican diplomacy. We're waiting to get a final edited copy from him with all of his footnotes, but I would point you to that because I think that's a very important lecture that he gave. The second point is he actually pointed to a new book by Juliana Comides on a 20th century history of Vatican diplomacy, which it's sitting on my gilt shelf. I have not read it yet, but it really does look quite interesting. But the final point I want to make is from a researcher's perspective, we actually do now have access to an insider's perspective in the sense that we now have living 4 or 5 U.S. ambassadors to the Holy See who all have very interesting stories to tell, and who I think from a historical perspective, it would be absolutely fascinating to see a student try to interview those 4 or 5 surviving ambassadors on these very questions. From the inside, what did it look like in the U.S. Vatican bilateral relationship, and as they observe the multilateral relationships there too. So there's as far as I know, no one has actually gone to those ambassadors and asked them if they'd be willing to go on the record for their historical insights on exactly these questions. So I think there's a ripe target there for any student who's interested in diplomatic history to do some very interesting research.
Before I give Michael the floor again, thank you for raising that, Shaun. There is a new book coming out, edited by Mariano Barbato, on the foreign policy of the Holy See, and I suggest you take a look at it. And it's an edited volume. So again, this is a brand new kind of approach, and it will probably be helpful to you. So I think I'm going to give the floor back to you, Michael, for a couple of minutes of wrap up.
I think we were both trying to unmute me. Thank you all for your comments. Trying to think of which to respond to. I think Professor Marshall, yours on the Holy See within. You said about within the UN as its status as a non-permanent observer. Trying to track around. I think that in particular is one of like the really interesting statuses that I was looking into, because like by the fact, well, firstly, it's taken that position within the UN by its own accord. It's chosen to have that kind of status, the Vatican at least, and by virtue of that, it's able to maintain its neutrality in a unique way that a lot of other states of the UN just inherently can't, because they're expected to vote on just, whatever issues they are, and that's my thoughts on that status there. I think of what other comments there was a long array of them. Trying to think here, but yeah, in general, did enjoy looking into this topic. It was the general comments about it's the Holy See's capacity as a lobbying entity that a number of people touched on. I think by the nature of the fact that it's representing the Roman Catholic Church, and that since it's able to rely on such a broad demographic and population that spread to every single, probably every single country in the world that had at least some Catholics. It has a very unique level of sway when compared to other religious transnational groups. Yeah, I'm sorry to jump around to like 5 or 6 comments to compare all at once, but overall, great topic, fun to look into.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to move to Rachel and the Russian policy in Serbia and Kosovo. This is really a very timely topic, if I may say so in a couple of minutes. There is now a whole interest in the use of Orthodoxy by the Russian state since the post-Soviet era. Putin is even called the Tsar. So there is a lot of interest in what's happening with between the state and the Orthodox Church internationally. But I would say be also attentive to the fact that it's not only the state instrumentalizing the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church in Russia has an interest to posit itself as a global actor, and it has 2 levels. First, as a leader of global orthodoxy, but also as a religious leader internationally. And in this respect, the policy of Putin in the Middle East has been key for that. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church has also posited itself as a defender of the discriminated Christian minorities in the Middle East. And they have also pushed something which is very interesting, the defense of traditional values internationally. So it's not just Putin using the Orthodox Church, it's also the ROC, taking advantage of the international position of the state to push an agenda, and the 2 are not completely synonymous. So it's a quid pro quo in other ways. So just to make the approach a little more nuanced, so not one way, but to look also at the other way, okay? So there is, again, I'd be happy to give you more bibliographical references on that, but for example, Christina Stockel, who we had her on a webinar recently, is someone you would be interested in reading on that particular topic. Yes. So on the comments section, there were José who wrote back on feedback, and I had also David and Katherine, if you want to add something. José, please.
I'll say a very brief word for Rachel, and it actually applies to several of the other presentations also. One of the questions, this may be related to what to Professor Cesari was just saying, but one way of formulating it would be, to what extent is the role of the Orthodox religion in this conflict, in this issue you're dealing with, a dependent variable, and in what sense is it an independent variable? In other words, is the way the Orthodox Church is behaving due to what the Russian government is setting out as an agenda? Or to what extent is it due to an internal Orthodox religious motivation? And those 2 dynamics, it seems to me, are obviously very much interactive, but determining which of them is really making the influence when decisions are being made would be an interesting challenge, it seems to me. And it would be, and I got the impression from your poster that you were stressing that the role that the Russian government was playing was basically setting the agenda that the Orthodox Church was having to follow. And that raises a question, given the history of Orthodoxy, and this may go back to José's, Casanova's point about the deep history here, about exactly what the deeper history of the role of the Orthodox Church may suggest. And anyway, it's a question that I had, and I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. José, please.
to
Yeah,
point out that that global orthodoxy today is a much more complex field than just the Russian Orthodox Church. And especially I would urge you to look at the tension conflict between the Ecumenical Patriarch and the Moscow Patriarchate. Look back to the 2016 Pan-Orthodox Holy Synod in Crete. This was something that had been prepared since Athanagoras, right after Vatican II, decided that they needed also a kind of global council of orthodoxy. It took for them 60 years to prepare this. Originally, Russia was the most interested, thinking that it would come out of this synod as the primus inter pares, but then the Ukrainian crisis interfered, and the conflict between Moscow and Constantinople came to a head. And looking which countries did not attend the council, those are the ones which are under Russian influence, namely Serbia, Bulgaria, Armenia, and the Patriarch of Antioch. All the others attended and followed the Ecumenical Patriarch. So this is crucial. If we are going to look beyond Serbia and to look at different relations of the Moscow Patriarchate and different Orthodox countries, that you look into a much broader field of contestations and tensions between the second and the third Rome.
Yeah, absolutely. Katherine?
I have to admit that this discussion brought back long, long ago memories of studying history. And I remember I used to get a headache every time the Balkans came up, just because of the sheer complexity. But I think one of the issues with the Balkans that was interesting thinking about it is that I don't think in studying those countries from over many years that the issue of religion ever came up. So the question of what's religion got to do with it in the historic tensions is a fascinating one that you're delving into. And I think the other issue, which also goes back during the Cold War period, was the extraordinary difficulty of understanding how the Soviet Union decided and what its motivations were. We used to talk about Kremlinology as an art form almost. And to some extent, I think that there still is some mystery, at least, about the decision-making process, which I think is in a sense at the core of what you're arguing is sort of, did they know what they were doing? And if so, what did they think they were doing? And what were they trying to achieve? And were they stupid, or were they ignoring large aspects? So I think it sort of underlines José Casanova's point that looking at the history as part of the thinking about the present is both valuable and essential.
Thank you, Katherine. Is there any other comment for Rachel? Yes, do.
Okay. I would add that it's important to look at more recent history. I think that since that region, the former Yugoslavia, comes out of an atheistic communist background, and that was quite advanced in particularly in Serbia. That needs to be taken into account into how Orthodoxy, both Serbian Orthodoxy and Russian Orthodoxy serve in that situation. It seems to me that given that context of the loss of meaning with the fall of communism, nationalism really becomes a very strong motive in both traditions because of their overall history, but also because the immediate situation was one in which was atheist, and so nationalism really comes to the fore as kind of the vector that's carrying the religion, it seems to me.
Thank you. Anybody else before I move to Rachel? Because Rachel, you have to leave, right? So I'm going to give you the floor back for 2 minutes. And you can go your way.
Of course. So I think what's hard for me is that I touched on this research in the spring of 2019, and I really haven't had the chance to go back to it just because of my course of study has changed dramatically from that time. But I do think that there is something to be said by the fact that I'm only looking at one case study. And so I think if I was to pursue this further and dive into it into a much larger thesis or a much larger research project, I think it is really crucial to look at other case studies and not just Serbia and Russia, especially when it comes to understanding like the historical background. I think where I really focused is, and what really influenced me, and maybe it was, maybe I was putting too much weight on it, was how during when the Soviet Union, right before World War II, the religion did not play a huge role in Russia. And so the Orthodox Church, as much as it still existed, it was very much suppressed under communism. And so I think for me, it was just a shock when it became more revived in its conversations, in the role of the Orthodox Church in peacemaking and peace building, due to the reconciliation that had to happen between the allies of World War II, that kind of brought to light this new role that Russia was assuming, like Russia was returning into Orthodoxy. And so I think if I was to expand the research, is to look at the huge scale of before religion was suppressed, as well as after religion, during when it was suppressed, and then after. And I think that's a timeline that is really important to like the grand scale of the study. But I only focus on the one, and I can see that, again, if I was to look into it further, that would also be really crucial.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to abuse of my position here to tell you, be careful that during the suppression, it was not completely eradicated. There were moments of repression, but moments also where the communist state used religion. World War II, the fight against Nazis, is a moment to reboost the role of the Orthodox Church. So let be always nuance here, okay? It was not completely destroyed. It was very much harmed, but not completely destroyed. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you. This was very stimulating. And now I'm moving to, if I follow my order here, we will discuss Matthew. Oh, bye-bye, Rachel. Sorry. I know you're leaving. Matthew, where is Matthew? I'm not seeing you.
I'm right here. I'm here.
How come I'm not seeing
Hello?
you? Oh, yes, now you're on.
Hi.
So Matthew, so this is really for me coming close to home, disciplinary speaking. Yes, there is no real work on the non-state actors used by some dominant states like the US. What you describe is quite accurate, but I didn't see any real approach to the religious dimension. You talked a lot about strategy. There was a question from David that I supported on sovereignty. You know, sovereignty is a strong term that is only associated, especially in this kind of conflict with the state. So also some care about the vocabulary and the terminology here. And if I may suggest something, it's not that, who makes these actors religious? Because, you know, you mentioned Kurds, but what is the religious dimension? Kurd is not a religion. So is it because they call themselves religious? Is it because the state, in this case the US, is looking at them as a religious tool? Or is it because they, as non-state actors, are tapping into either religious rhetoric or religious resources to advance their fight? What you are describing is very secular in all aspects, even if we can label some of them religious. So I would really not shy away from the religious dimension. It doesn't mean, as you mentioned in your comment, that it's about theology. I'm not sure it's about theology, but it's for sure question of who is looking at religion in this particular context. And it's not only what you can see a priori would say as religious actors. Americans have, when it was convenient, look at religious fight. Afghanistan is a case in point. When it was the time the Mujahideen were welcome in the fight of the US against the Soviets. So you have, it's not because it's religious non-state that the secular state doesn't also use religion. That's my caution here to you. So I will pass the floor to the colleagues who have less comment. So José, you wrote about that in the...
Yeah, well, I took the liberty of speaking so bluntly because I was fortunate to have Matthew as a student in my seminar. I'm still not finished on global religion secular dynamics, and Matthew is writing a fantastic research project on the history and meaning and uses of takfir, the apostasy, the claim of apostasy. And obviously I admire very much your skills as a researcher. I think you are a very, very careful researcher, but sometimes I think you should try to be beyond, not to be over careful in terms of be careful with the categories you use because they are more complex. There's, you know, terrorism, counterterrorism, and even the alliances. In your response, you pointed out that you only want to look at this, but obviously the alliance with the Kurds began in the war of Iraq. That was very little a war against terrorism, unless you want to argue. So there are implications in the way the US has been working in the Middle East that go beyond the war on terrorism. It has to do with geopolitical strategies of imperial actors. So I would recommend that, yes, for the purposes of analytical scientific papers, you need to be as precise as possible, but I want you to be, as a researcher, to be a little critical and take some distance from this scientific work to look to the more problematic aspects of sociopolitical and geopolitical relations.
Thank you. David?
Point. This is a minor point, but it may be related to the question about, well, definition of state and definition of sovereignty and so forth. And it leads me to think about the definition of non-state actor. What counts as a non-state actor? There are agents operating in the territory where you're examining that aspire to control states and that have a very strong, explicitly political agenda, which they're not sovereign states, but they have aspiration to, if not become a state, to at least have a significant control over a state or influence on a state. And that means that some of these dynamics between non-state actor and state politics and so forth can be kind of ambiguous. A case that I know more about would be if you go back to the days in South Africa before apartheid had come to an end. The African National Congress was a non-state actor in South Africa. But since independence, it's been running South Africa for the last 20 years as a sort of the political party in control there. So whether to see ANC in South Africa in the days when Mandela was still in prison as a non-state actor, it's certainly a different kind of non-state actor than the International Committee of the Red Cross or an agent that has very little explicit political agenda. So it's just a question of clarifying and whether that's relevant to the dynamics that you're studying, because it's raising the question of how much is the agenda of the groups that you're studying really political, or how much is it religious, how much is it cultural, and so forth. So those kinds of questions emerged for me as I was reading what you wrote. And it doesn't disagree with anything you've said. It's just pressing for a further clarification.
Thank you, David. Drew, you have your hand up. So.
Yes. Thank you, Jocelyne. Matthew, just a word in your defense with respect to to Syria when I was following developments there much more closely than I do today. The Free Syrian Army really was a mixture of Muslim rebels and Christian rebels. And one of the things I did was to be able to get support from the West, was to keep the Christians, mostly lay people, not clerics, at the head of the organization and as representatives of the organization. And so both were seeking. I think the Christians were more interested in political freedom. The Muslims certainly, since they were Sunni, were interested in religious freedom within Syria. And it might be helpful to tease out some of that background to show how there is a religious dimension to their role as non-state actors.
Thank you, Katherine.
I think one of the most difficult issues all of us are wrestling with in sort of religion and global affairs is the question of what's religion got to do with it. And you can have panels where you will have one person talking about Nigeria say that this is entirely a religious conflict, and somebody else will say this has absolutely nothing to do with religion. So those were the questions, as Jocelyne, I think, was raising in her comments of what does this have to do with religion? Clearly, there's a religious identity. There's a religious relationship and character and history of the states involved. But how far is it simply that you put yourself in one box, or what does it actually have to do with the beliefs of the individuals and the way that the understandings of religious identity are tied into national identity and therefore into the nature of the conflict? So that, I think that you sort of took this really has nothing to do with religion, even if they are Sunni or whatever. But I think that it is a very fundamental question that we're wrestling with. And it's hard to avoid it in looking at the cases that you present, because they do often seem to have that character, even if it's hard to figure out exactly how it plays through.
Thank you, Katherine. I'm going to give the floor back to Matthew to wrap up.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm going to go through, I took notes on everyone's comments. I just want to go through everyone kind of chronologically as you went. Starting with, I mean, Professor Cesari and Professor Marshall kind of had a similar comment, so I'll address both of yours first. As you know, this did originate as this is my government honors thesis, but I adjusted it to kind of focus on religion more for these purposes. I would argue that it absolutely does have to do with religion. As I mentioned in my response to you, Professor Marshall, and your comment, these groups are kind of the pinnacle of how fragile religious unity is. So the Syrian Free Army, as Professor Christiansen mentioned, yes, absolutely had Syriac Christians. The Free Syrian Army, their enemy was the Assad regime, was the state. When I studied the Syrian Democratic Forces, they got a lot of their power because they were being ignored by the world attention on the Syrian civil war. So they were much worried about their land being taken away by the Islamic State, and there were other non-Arab, non-Muslim groups that were doing it, but I'll circle back to that. But in the SDF, the US specifically recruited people outside of the YPG, which is kind of this armed wing of the most popular Syrian Kurdish political party, so that it wouldn't look like the US was just partnering with the Syrian Kurds. Now we hear, we have abandoned Syrian Kurds, we have left Syrian Kurdistan, which is all true, but there were other groups too, thousands of which that were involved in it. As I said, Assyrian Christians, Armenians, Chechens, Syrian tribal militias that have their own indigenous religions that don't necessarily fall into what we're talking about today. And a part of that is that they, my hypothesis regarding the SDF in relation to their territory and their sovereign territory, a lot of what I found was that a huge part of having the territory was the motivation. That having their own territory gave them motivation that the US couldn't artificially produce for them. That they needed the US's help because they didn't have the resources to get their homeland back. So there were other religious groups that were typically at odds with the Syrian Kurds who either lived in Syrian Kurdistan, very much to the chagrin of the Kurds, or lived in Syria or Iraqi Kurdistan, right outside of it, that typically have been at very much violent odds with the YPG or the PKK. But after the US kind of recruited them into the school, had worked a lot on objective interest alignment at the time, I found that it was kind of this pinnacle of religious unity because the objective interest alignment was so strong that they were willing to put their religious differences aside. So I kind of see there the use of counterterrorism almost as a religious unifier. In the case of the Afghan local police, many were Afghan Hazara, which are mostly Shia, Uzbek, which are mostly Sunni, Sindhis, which are Sunni and Hindu, Afghan Punjabi, which are Sikh and Hindu. So you have a lot of religious plurality in Afghanistan, which was definitely not, I would say, wasn't really considered by the United States. So this was a mistake that was made. So in the case of the SDF, it was intentional. In the case of the ALP, I can't say, whether it was really considered or not. What I do know is that in the case where ALP units who were ethnically or religiously different from the district to which they were assigned to protect, this is where you get a lot of conflict. So I'm not saying that it is solely religious, but I'm saying that I think it's largely tribal, but these tribes come with a lot of religious identities and a lot of religious differences. So I think, as someone mentioned, I'm not sure if it's purely theological, but the religious aspect of these conflicts when it comes to the failure of U.S. counterterrorism policy via these proxies can't be ignored. So that's what I'll say on that. Professor Casanova, I think that I did want to be pretty niche in my research. My advisor also it started much bigger. Let me trust me. It started as 130 pages. It's about 90 now, and I'm happy to share it with anyone who kind of wants to read more into it. But I find that terrorism is actually clearly defined. I can define it very pretty clearly, and I do in my paper as well as what counterterrorism counts as. So I didn't feel super ambiguous in my use of terrorism in my paper. But although it can, depending on who you talk to, can have different definitions. I'll also say I would argue against counterterrorism in the Middle East now being an instrument of imperialism or colonialism. The Iraq War, I hate to admit, is even American foreign policy, because I just think it was Bush and Cheney making their own decisions for the American people with kind of apprehensive support from their own cabinet, which is not what foreign policy should be built on. And it was a lot of mistakes were obviously made during the Iraq War, but the Kurdish relationship with the US didn't start until 2014. So we were very focused on Syrian civil war, as well as the rise of extremism in Iraq, because the Islamic State, as we know it today, kind of rose out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, which, after multiple iterations, Jabhat al-Nusra, multiple iterations, kind of grew into Syria, which is where you get ISIS from, in Iraq and then Syria. So it wasn't until much later that we were really worried about terrorism in Syria. Certainly was not a concern during the Iraq War, so we really had no use for the Kurds. So the Kurdish relationship didn't start until the end of 2014, when in the Kurdish city of Kobane, the Syrian Kurds were getting absolutely devastated by the Islamic State, and we took a year or two to decide whether or not to drop weapons and ammunition and first aid and healthcare supplies to them. And we found that after we did that, it was a very risky decision because Turkey considers them to be a terrorist group. So we didn't want to risk a relationship that we have with a NATO ally. But we did. We potentially jeopardized that, which has its own risks and fallbacks as well. But we airdropped them supplies and realized shortly after that they took back the city of Kobane. And I think the US kind of went through this reflection period after spending billions of dollars on arming failed Arab rebels for a number of reasons that I can also comment on why those were failed. And we found that, you know, if only we could give the Syrian Kurds more, give them more support, give them more manpower with these other groups, give them more tactical training, then they can do a lot more with what we give them. And they did. They took away almost all the Islamic State's territory in Syria. And then I'll try to be brief. Professor Hollenbach, I completely understand what you're saying. It's a very, it is a very tricky area with, you know, non-state actors in this context of having sovereignty. I would say it's very rare that this is the case that a non-state actor has sovereignty, but I would say it's very true in the case of the Syrian Kurds, at least in the Rojava region. They declared full sovereignty and autonomy in 2013. They have their own local elections, have a regional constitution, they have full diplomatic power. So I don't know if that exists elsewhere. I'm sure it might at a much smaller degree, but at least in Syria, Kurdistan, they're very much, you know, with the exception of being internationally recognized as a state, they're definitionally sovereign. But and the Kurds don't aspire to control Syria, but they absolutely do want to become a recognized state. And you mentioned the ANC is a great example of how terrorism ends. There are a few theories on how it ends, and one of them is when a terrorist group accomplishes its goal. So that was the ANC, and they were removed from the US terrorist list in 2008, and they accomplished their goal. No longer a terrorist group, no longer has to use violence for their objective. The type of non-state groups that I look at are non-state, non-terrorist, but violent non-state groups. So I look at non-state groups who have used violence, but it's usually against other non-state actors who are terrorists. So, and these are almost all the time religious minorities, ethnic minorities, tribal minorities. So these were the non-state groups that I mostly looked at. I hope that addresses most or all of your questions or concerns. Again, I'm happy to answer more questions about it later if you'd like.
Thank you. Now we move to Samuel's paper on comparing the Temple Mount and Ayodhya disputes. It happened that I just wrote a paper on that for the Journal of Religion, Law and Society, and so I can talk a lot about this. So I'm going to restrain myself. Samuel, are you here?
Yep. Go ahead.
A few comments on that. The thing to really focus on in the comparison is what is the sacred dimension of the nation that intersect with the sacred dimension of the site itself. And this is key to understand the differences between the two, in the sense that in the case of the Temple Mount, this is the core of the sacred community of Jews. You know, this is a place where God and people communicate. So this is sacred on its, I would say, religious terms. And for Muslims, the question has been moved from the place where the Prophet Muhammad moved away or traveled to the question of the sanctity or sacredness of Jerusalem for the nation state of Palestine. So this is not the same level. But the two exist. The point is not to say it's one and the other. It's two different things that are intertwined in the fact that the site is a zone of conflict. Because for Jews, Jerusalem and the Temple Mount have become also a sacred site for the nation. I just read a polling that is stupefying, where the majority of Israelis think that the temple has to be rebuilt by the president. This is not religious anymore. This is not messianistic anymore. This is the sacred, to talk like Durkheim, totem of my nation. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is that there are different temporalities of sacredness that explain that these sites become very, very contentious, not only for religious reasons, because as you said, there have been always skirmishes and tensions on the two. But how does it become a national and political issue? For the Ayodhya, it's the same thing. You said it, there have been several, you know, a building of mosque and temple. It is only in the modern phase that the timing, the status of Ayodhya is not only the holy site in itself. It's what does it mean for the Indian nation in its Hindu component. You know, so here I would like to bring to you the attention to the work of Peter van der Veer, who, looking exactly at this issue, has said that what is at stake here, and I would say it's the same thing for Israel, it's not only the space, it's also the time, in the sense that who is the group that can claim the longest presence and the longest possession of this particular site. And again, this is where the holy site of the birthplace of a particular god become also the symbol for the Hindu character of the nation of India. So that's, I can go on and say, so I'm going to stop right there. But this is fascinating. I would like to share with you the draft of this paper, because it's like, oh, wow, someone is also working on that. So this was fun. I'm going to pass to my colleagues. José, do you want to say something? Katherine had just raised her hand, so I give you the floor, Katherine.
You may have detected in some of the way that I frame questions that I want to put you into the position of what do you want to do about it? In this case, you focused a lot on something that we do talk about and think about a lot, which is opposing narratives, and the fact that people are very deeply stuck in, you could put it that way, or that they are deeply committed to a specific narrative that draws certain facts. And there have been a number of recommendations, particularly around the Middle East and the holy sites, about trying to find ways to reconstruct a narrative that would include basically both sides. So I'm interested in what you do about that. How might you go about that? I don't know what position to give you, whether the mayor of Jerusalem or, you know, some position. What are you going to do? And how might you be able to break through some of these, actually what somebody refers to as poisonous texts, sort of dangerous selections of fact, and move that in a new direction?
José, you want to? Hold on.
Well, I'm going to say something along the lines already Jocelyne has mentioned, and I was going to mention the work of Peter van der Veer on this. I just wanted to point out that besides the importance of a state and nation, that here one important difference is that the Jerusalem case goes beyond a state and nation to become a transnational issue, because you have precisely the attempt to create a Jerusalem, which is a non-city, a transnational or international city. So the conflict has a much greater transnational dimension because of the Christian dimension, the Holy See, etc., than the Ayodhya, which is basically an internal Hindu-Muslim conflict within India. Obviously, it can be internationalized, but there is a dimension here which makes it the two cases different.
Mm. Drew, you raised your hand.
Okay, Jocelyne, thank you. I think I'd push back a little bit to you, Jocelyne, in saying that I think that the notion of nationhood has changed in India, and that's part of the difficulty, is that the consensus had been that the way India, these various faiths could survive in India without conflict was to have a secular state, and the state would monitor things, and that what you have from the very beginning with the PJP is a desire to make India not a secular state, but a Hindu state, and that program is continuing with great vigor these days under Modi, with discriminating against recent immigrants who have been naturalized and say no, they can't be naturalized, and so on and so forth. And so the whole question of national identity switched in the midst of all this, it seems to me. And that needs to be taken into account.
If I may, I'm going to abuse here of my capacity, but you are right that there is an increase with the BGP ruling, but the question of IODIA has been going on, and there are previous, and what this Peter van der Veer showed it very nicely, that there is always tension, including the modern state trying to regulate locally between Hindus and Muslims. So we have to, I think the state and the nation are not the same. There is a secular state, but locally, the movements that have led to the victory of the BGP have been there since the 1920s, and they have been very vocal locally to maintain some kind of possession on some sides. So it's not because, again, the state and the nation do not match, but I cannot say more about this. So there is a continuity more than we think, even if we are not aware of it. David, you wanted to say something?
Well, a very brief question, really, and that is, Samuel was talking about ways in which around the dispute about the Temple Mount and the mosque, on the Temple Mount and so forth, that there have been some, you mentioned, I think the word you used was concessions by the Israeli government to the Muslim side on that issue, and that has brought a certain kind of peacefulness to the issue. I would want to, whatever the concessions that have been made about the issues on the Temple Mount, the larger conflict between Palestinian Muslims, Palestinians in general, but certainly Muslims included, and the Israeli state is not moderated. The conflict is is deeply underway. Where it's going to go, no one knows at this point. And so the question that I have is how the dispute about the territory around the Temple Mount is related to these larger political questions that are underway between the Israeli state and the non-Jews, whether they're Palestinians or Muslim or Christian Palestinians or whatever. That larger conflict it seems to me, is very important. And I just was concerned when you were suggesting that there had been a kind of more or less resolution through some concessions. I'm not at all sure that we can be very confident of that, given the larger conflicts that are still unresolved.
Thank you, David. If there is no more comments, feedback for Samuel, I will give you the floor.
Great,
Samuel.
thank you. No, I think those were all really good points. I think these issues are particularly complex, especially a lot of political baggage. And just to start off with Professor Hollenbach's point, where there's the whole issue of whether there's really a resolution on Temple Mount. And I think something I was really pointed at, especially in my paper where I had more room to expound on this, was kind of the distinction between more of a religious, theological resolution versus a broader political resolution, where in a lot of ways, like from the Israeli perspective, like what can you really do when you are negotiating with a group that does not even acknowledge your existence, versus there is some significant initiatives on their front to at least allow Muslim worshippers to have access to the site. And that was kind of the distinction I was trying to draw out, especially in the context of India, where there isn't necessarily the same pushback against like India's existence as a state, but there is a lot of tension versus the nature of the Indian government, whether or not it is a predominantly Hindu nation. I think that's a great point of distinction between nations and states, and then giving them the opportunity to maybe still be able to move with the current situations on the ground and make concessions in a similar spirit, I think, more than necessarily a similar exact situation. And then to address the point kind of on like what I want to see done next, I think it may be a little cynical or pessimistic, but I think in a lot of ways, if you look at the history of these sites, they go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the bottom line is, from a religious perspective, very little you can do unless the religious majority has political control over the region. And so I think in both situations, you have pretty solid, like a political state of affairs where India and Israel have established de facto control of site. Even the Israeli site, you can argue that Jerusalem's contested, it's an international site, but for all intents and purposes, Israel has significant military superiority in the region, and like if they needed to, would be able to fight and control Jerusalem, which they did post 1967. And so given that reality, I think what I thought was very important was being able to work with what was already happening on the ground, and then be able to integrate the minority groups in different capacities to still give them access to the site, ensure that the prospects for violence are mitigated moving forward. So that was kind of my thought process. I think in my paper I was able to expand on this in a bit more depth. I think those are all really valid critiques and points to look further into. So thank you all.
Thank you, Samuel. So we are going now to Wales and China. This is also a very fascinating topic. I think your question is right on target. You know, why the difference between the treatment of religion? And to make a long story short, because again, with this transnational team, we spent 2 years looking at the way that Chinese state regulates religious groups, and what is clear and what is central is the loyalty to not only the state, but to a certain continuity of China, both in its principles and also in its territory. So it's not just that the religious groups behave civically. It means that all religious groups have to show that they are putting China before their religious principles. And some can and some cannot. The Falun Gong is a case in point. The moment that the Falun Gong tried to challenge the political sovereignty of China, they became a persecuted group, where you have multiple groups like they are, that are not showing the same collective identity. The moment you want to show a religious collective identity within China, you are in trouble. And the same thing with Buddhism. You know, Buddhism is an issue when Tibet wants independence. Same thing with Islam. Islam is an issue when the particular region, Xinjiang, want independence. There are terms emerging in the vocabulary of China, which is splitism. If you want to split, you are in trouble. So it's not the religion as such. It's what the relationship of this religious group with not only the sovereignty of the state, but the acceptation that China comes first. And that fantastic internal discussion among religious groups. Christian, what does this mean? Where do my loyalty live? And some Christians go all the way to show that the love for Christ is compatible with the love for China, and others don't. And that's why Catholics are still in trouble, because their allegiance is beyond the Chinese state. So there are lots of things here that are really fascinating, because if I translate this in religious terms, it means that the Chinese state is the transcendent place in some way. In the work we did, this is where, nowhere else, not in Muslim countries, not anywhere else, the term God and the term state came together. I've never seen this anywhere. So there is here a transcendence of not only the state institution, but what China means. And again, to go back to the argument of history, it has an history. It is the emperor as the overarching principle of all other religion, you know. So there is something in there that goes with both the territorial dispute, but also the fact that some religious groups have hard time to put China first. That would be my 2 cents here. José, José, Katherine, David, well, okay, José.
Yes, I agree with what Jocelyne was saying. This is crucial, but the fundamental difference is the emergence of the modern nation state.
Yeah, exactly.
The Chinese empire, maybe the emperor was God, but it had ways of dealing with difference. It had ways of incorporating Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism was at the center of the court. And it had ways of incorporating the Uyghurs. They had been incorporated to the Chinese Empire. It is the mother nation state that does not allow dealing with this plurality within. And it is the homogeneization of the signification of the Chinese state. Let's not forget that the rulers were not Chinese. And it is the signification, the fusion of nation and the old model of the God Emperor, which is really what makes it almost impossible to solve. China cannot solve these issues within the context of the nation state. It could solve them if it would understand itself as a plurality of sovereignties within a sovereignty. But so, and again, I would argue the temporal dimension here. From the 1950s to now, the Communist Party has dealt with these groups very differently in different contexts. Even between 20 years ago or 15, when we were dealing with the Committee of Religious Affairs in Beijing before Xi Jinping, it was a very different situation with respect to religion, when they were to bring religion to play a harmonious role. Obviously, it's always under state control, but the type of state control also changes throughout these 50 years of the regime. If we cannot say this is a constant, there are a lot of differences within this constancy and continuity.
Thank you. David, did you write some? Yeah.
Well, I would just raise a question for Will that this has to do maybe with going back to the question of history again. I brought up a little bit in my comments that I wrote about the deeper history going way back all the way to, if you're going to look at Catholicism, you go back to Ricci, and which is centuries ago and so forth, and you could do something similar with regard to Islam, having been there a long time before the Communist Party was, and so forth. But you mentioned in your response, I saw, that I understand that the issue, but another interesting question that I would ask from a historical point of view is, has there not been evolution in the attitudes in the Chinese Communist Party toward religion, just since the party has been in control? Certainly there seems to me I'm not an expert on this, but just a little observation of reading that I've done, there seems to me to have been a greater openness on the part of the Chinese communist rulers toward saying that we should take Confucianism seriously, or more seriously than we did. And I know there are arguments about what Confucianism is and whether it's philosophy or religion and so forth. But anyway, there certainly has been an evolution in that area. And it opens the question about whether there can be openness to development on the part of the attitudes of the party today toward religion. And the history would also give some answers to the question of why is the party as strongly worried about control of religion today when it isn't as kind of formalistically atheist as it would have been under Mao Zedong. It seems to be more political motivation. But then the question becomes, if political issues change, is there the possibility that the party's approach to this or the state's approach to this could change also? Anyway, that's a question that I'm asking mainly from the point of view of where is this going and what might lead it to move in one direction rather than in another.
Thank you. Katherine, you want to add something?
I found the way that you categorized and analyzed the different religions' relationships with the government fascinating. And you have a great chart. You have a great analysis, I think, of it. And the whole concept of a tacit or an explicit social contract of some kind. And obviously that raises all kinds of questions. And in this case, I'm less focusing on the history than on the present. How far do different theological beliefs or ideological beliefs by different religious communities play out? In other words, or how far is it personalities, the people who are the leaders of different traditions that have led them to be what might be considered more pragmatic or more oppositional? Even within the Catholic communities, there are these divisions of the ways in which different parts of it relate to basically a huge and powerful state, not to speak of different Muslim communities. So what are the factors that are helping to give clues in a difficult to analyze situation about the way different communities are finding their way in a very complicated and I think very dynamic landscape?
So Drew, I am also told that we should wrap up by 1:45. So we are in a dilemma here, Drew, and then I give the floor back to Will for the wrap up.
Okay, having been involved in this negotiations between the Vatican and the Chinese for a number of years, I'd say that the point that was made about the shift of government is really important. It's not a single government with a single policy. Under the two previous presidents, there was a collective leadership. The decisions were made by the standing committees, which consisted of 15 people. There were divisions, and I won't go into that now, but as to how they would relate to the church. But there was a great deal of flexibility and support for those who pledged their loyalty to the state. And there were divisions over that, mostly because Catholics were divided over it internally, and not because the Vatican didn't want relations. And the Vatican held up because of that for the longest time. Having Francis as Pope also makes a difference, because Francis believes in the multicultural variety of the church. And so he could accept the Chinese notion that it's a civilizational state and you need to have a certain kind of Chinese flavor to the church without necessarily meaning you have to make the president God. But Xi Jinping, on the other hand, wants to form a government that has absolute control of everything. It's a personal kind of totalitarianism. The second year he took office, he had the standing committee take a personal oath to him of allegiance. And that was the end of the collective leadership. And, you know, the crackdown on all sorts of groups proceeded from there, beginning with the so-called crackdown on corruption. So the character of the government, I think you're seeing both in India and in China, has a lot to do with the relationship with religions. And that needs to be taken into account, I think.
Thank you, Drew. So Will, you have, I give you 2 minutes. We give him 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. So first I wanted to express my agreement with the point that it's really not the religion itself that scares the government. It's whether or not the group in objective terms is willing to be loyal. So this was kind of, like I said, something I noticed when I went to China regarding Muslims, because when I went, I thought, okay, China just has a problem with Muslims. But then I was eating at this Hui Muslim restaurant every single morning, and the people owning the restaurant seemed to love the government and hate Uyghurs. And so I really wanted to examine that nuance more. And I realized that there was a sect of Islam that did get along great with the government. Professor Casanova, you mentioned signification, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit more regarding Catholicism. So yes, signification is very clear. The Uyghurs have a party advisor. The Catholics have a party advisor. The quest to make religion distinctly Chinese is very clear. Professor Hollenbach, you asked about evolution and attitudes. So generally speaking, it is always hard to blanketly define how the CCP deals with anything. Everything they do is very ad hoc. And so saying that there has been an evolution in attitudes is true, but it really depends on the religion. So there has been an evolution in attitudes towards Catholics because Pope Francis has done a good job of leading negotiations with the Chinese government and, you know, accepting some of their terms to ensure Catholicism's survival. But it's also very arbitrary. Changes in leadership have meant that groups who personally challenge a certain leader might suffer more. And then finally, an evolution in attitudes in religion has been brought about by international awareness, which really scares China because they don't like the idea of other countries being critical about their internal affairs. So they try to respond carefully, but they also try to push away international intervention. And this is really playing out with the Uyghurs right now. And then finally, Confucianism was another interesting example of an ad hoc method they had of dealing with something. So they knew that they couldn't just erase Confucianism from their history because that would be far too disingenuous. So what they did instead was label it as a philosophy. They took away the religious label so that there was no hypocrisy. There was no way for people to contextualize Confucianism against all of the religions that they had already suppressed. One more thing, Professor Marshall asked how far the theological beliefs play out, and this is also kind of determined on an ad hoc and personal basis. So the Pope has been a great negotiator, and because of that, Catholicism has really prospered in China because his personal relationship with the Chinese government has allowed that to happen. And because of that, the Chinese government has a lot more trust in Catholics now than it used to. And Professor Christiansen, I'd love to know more about how these negotiations have gone and your opinion on whether or not the Pope really is a good negotiator. So thanks for sharing a bit about that as well.
Thank you, Will. So we have come to the end of the collective discussion. So there is a possibility to continue in breakout groups. It's not mandatory, but if you want to continue the discussion in smaller group, we can do that. So I need to show some, I need to see some show of hands.
I'm going to have to go now.
Okay. Who wants?
I also have a meeting at 2.
Okay. So I would rather see the people who can rather than the one who cannot. It may help. So I can. So that's it. Okay. So it's okay. There is no issue with that at all. So we stop here. I want to thank all of you for following the times and for being so engaged despite the coldness of the medium, as we would say. I want also to mention that we are trying to set up with our colleagues, both the faculty and the administrative team, some kind of conversation of this kind, and feel free to send to Ryann some suggestions, and we can work out with other colleagues on how to continue this discussion on some topics that you think of interest. The goal of this discussion would be to have you students as part of the Berkeley community engage with not only one-on-one, but several of us together. So we are welcoming your suggestions and demands on that. So thank you.
Could I raise this one thing that sort of struck me is I don't think anyone mentioned interreligious relationships and dialogue. And yet Susan Hayward from the U.S. Institute of Peace sort of put that as one of the great post-COVID hopes. So just one sort of very quick thought.
Thank you, Katherine. If there is no more comments or questions, we can break now. Ryann, you're the one in command, so you.
Yes, so I'll just thank all of you again for joining us. Thank you especially to the students for your presentations, your posters, and your willingness to participate in this discussion in such an unusual format. And thank you to the faculty for such an engaging discussion and for really interacting with the students' research and giving them a lot of incredible feedback that I'm sure they will go and take a closer and a deeper look at the things that you've talked about. And I appreciate all of your time and would like to also thank my Berkley Center colleagues for joining us as well.